The 19th day, April 26th, 1945. Or maybe it was already the 27th. The clocks had long since stopped, and time here, at a depth of 90 meters, nearly 300 feet, had transformed into something else. A viscous, cold substance, like the fuel oil that coated everything. Inside the steel coffin named U-2342 with a thin, iridescent film. The air, you couldn't call it air anymore. It was a thick, almost tangible mixture of carbon dioxide, the fumes of unwashed bodies, the acrid smell of machine oil, and the all-pervading sweetish stench of despair that seemed to emanate from the steel bulkheads themselves. This air grated on the teeth, settled as a sticky film in the lungs, making each breath an agonizing conscious effort, like lifting an impossible weight with the last of one's strength. In the dim, ghostly light of a single emergency lamp, fed by the last dying amps of the ship's batteries, the men's faces seemed like death masks carved from dirty wax. Sunken, sallow cheeks stretched over gray, almost transparent skin. Dark, bottomless pits for eyes, which held no fear, no hope, not even hatred. Only an endless, dull, all-consuming exhaustion. They sat and lay in unnatural frozen poses, instinctively conserving every movement, every heartbeat, every precious sip of poisoned air. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Richter, their commander, their prophet, and their god in this underwater hell, hadn't moved for hours. He sat at the navigation table, his unblinking gaze fixed on a chart of the Baltic Sea that had long lost all meaning and become an abstract pattern. His face, once strong and imperious with sharp Aryan features, had withered into a gaunt skull. But in the depths of his eyes, beneath swollen eyelids, a cold, fanatical ember still glowed. He still believed. He clung to his faith like a climber to the last ledge over an abyss. Believed in his orders, in the invincibility of the Reich, in their inevitable rescue. This faith was the only thing still keeping his spine straight, preventing him from collapsing into dust like the others. Opposite him, leaning against a cold, damp bulkhead, sat Chief Engineer Erich Müller. His powerful hands, accustomed to hot levers and tight valves, lay limp on his knees, caked in dried grease and grime. He watched the commander with a quiet, frozen, almost indifferent hatred. Müller was a pragmatist to the bone. He believed not in the Führer or in Providence, but in the laws of physics, in the pressure of the water on the hull, in the chemical composition of the air that was slowly and inexorably killing them. And all his calculations, which he ran over and over in his weary mind, said one thing. They weren't being searched for. They had long been written off. They had simply been forgotten. Between these two poles, fanatical faith bordering on madness and icy, mathematically precise despair, the other 18 surviving souls were suspended. A young sailor, Hans, who had barely turned 18, lay in his corner, his breath a barely audible, intermittent rattle. He was rarely conscious anymore. His young body was the first to give out, unable to endure this marathon of death. His silent agony was a mute but terrifying reproach to all the rest. Silence. It was the main enemy here, almost absolute, dense, pressing on the eardrums. It was not broken by working machinery or voices, only a barely audible, constant, maddening creak. It was the groaning of metal. It was the hull of the boat, their armor and their prison, complaining about the monstrous, relentless pressure of 90 meters of icy water above them. It was the sound of their slow, inevitable burial alive. How had they come to this? How had the elite of the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Dönitz's proud gray wolves, ended up in this trap, transformed into the living dead, forgotten at the bottom of the sea, unaware that the war they were still stubbornly dying for was practically over? To understand this, to taste their last hope before it turned to ash and grated on their teeth, we must go back 19 endless days, to the day they were still soldiers, not phantoms. To that distant, almost unreal day when their world collapsed forever. April 7th, 1945. U-2342, one of the newest type Desai-1 boats, a technological marvel nicknamed the electric boat for its ability to move underwater almost silently and at unprecedented speed, glided like a silent shadow through the cold, dark waters of the Baltic. Inside its compartments it was cramped but still smelled of life, of ozone from the running electric motors, of hot metal, of strong ersatz coffee, and of confidence. Life went on, governed by the strict, measured rhythm of a war patrol, where every minute was scheduled. The crew of 44 men was a typical blend for the time. Experienced veterans whose faces resembled sea charts, and fresh-faced youths for whom this was their first patrol, their eyes still burning with the fire of naive excitement. They were confident in themselves, in their superior technology, and above all, in their commander. Kapitän-Leutnant Klaus Richter was not just an officer. He was an ideology incarnate. Tall, fit, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, he looked as if carved from northern granite. He was a true Aryan not only by blood but by spirit. His faith in National Socialism was absolute, unshakable, like the steel hull of his boat. He spoke of the Führer and the coming victory as if he stood beside them, as if the catastrophic defeats on all fronts, the retreat, and the agony of the Reich were merely temporary difficulties, another test of the indomitable German spirit. And the men believed him, because in this thundering, collapsing world, his icy confidence was the only reliable anchor. His complete opposite was Chief Engineer Erich Müller, a middle-aged man with weary eyes in which technical documents seemed permanently etched, and hands that were a living extension of his diesel engines. Müller didn't talk politics. His world was pressure gauges, valves, blueprints, and schematics. He loved his machines more than people because machines were honest. They either worked or they didn't. They didn't lie about victory when everything was going to hell. He respected Richter as a commander with professional deference, but his fanaticism provoked a dull, hidden irritation in the engineer. For Müller, the war was not a sacred mission, but hard, dirty work that had to be done well in order to survive and return home to his wife and 2 daughters, whose photographs he kept in the pocket of his oil-stained tunic. Somewhere between these 2 poles existed the rest of the crew. Chief Boatswain Kurt Wagner, an old sea dog who had served in the First World War, who treated everyone, including the commander, with a paternal condescension and knew 1,000 tales for every occasion. The young radio man, Werner Voss, a self-taught genius with perpetually frightened eyes, who could build a radio receiver from a tin can and a piece of wire, but was afraid to even look through the periscope. And of course Hans Schmidt, the cabin boy, the youngest on board, almost a child. He barely shaved, blushed at any coarse word, and every evening before sleep he would reread a worn letter from his mother, in which he asked him to eat well and wear warm underwear. That evening, April 7th, Hans was, as usual, sitting in his corner, tracing clumsy, childish letters on a sheet of paper by the light of a dim lamp. He was writing home, to a small town near Dresden, not knowing that the town practically no longer existed, that it had been wiped off the face of the earth by Allied carpet bombing. He wrote about how proud he was to serve on such a modern boat, about their brave and wise commander, and that soon, very soon, they would be victorious, and he would return home a true hero. He didn't know that this letter would never be sent. He didn't know that the sound he would hear in a few hours would not be the thud of an enemy shell against their armor, but the impact of his own world, still full of hope, against the viscous, bottomless floor of the damned Baltic Sea. It all began suddenly, as it always does in war. The sonar operator, a young man named Schultz, who had been listening intently to the silence of the depths, suddenly froze like a hound scenting its prey. He tore the headphones from his head as if they had burned him. His face instantly turned white as paper. "Propellers, starboard side, high-speed target, Herr Kapitän. A destroyer, maybe 2. They're coming straight for us." The words cracked like a whip in the resonant silence of the central command post. Klaus Richter reacted instantly, his response honed by hundreds of hours of drills. His voice was as cold and calm as the icy water outside the hull. "Emergency dive to 100 meters. Dead slow. Silent running." The boat, like a living, obedient creature, dipped its nose and began to descend into the saving, impenetrable darkness. But it was too late. They had been spotted. They had been heard. First came the sound. Not the roar of an explosion, no. A deep, gut-wrenching, crushing jolt that traveled not through the ears, but through the steel hull of the boat, through the deck, through the soles of their boots, and slammed directly into the spine, into every bone, every nerve of every crew member. A second of confusion, as the brain refused to believe what the body already understood. And then, hell. A column of water boiled up a dozen meters, about 40 feet from its side by the explosion of a depth charge, struck the submarine with the force of a gigantic invisible hammer. The boat was thrown, tossed, and spun in a death dance. Men who hadn't braced themselves were hurled against bulkheads, instruments, and red-hot pipes. Shards of shattered light fixtures rained down. From a damaged pipe, a jet of superheated steam erupted with a deafening hiss, scalding everything in its path. The wounded screamed. Red emergency lighting flooded the compartments with a crimson, hellish glow, turning the scene into something out of the abyss. And then, a second impact. Closer. More powerful. Something in the aft compartment cracked with a deafening, sickening screech. The boat listed sharply, and everyone understood. They were sinking, uncontrollably, unstoppably. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Depth charges were exploding on all sides, enclosing them in a ring of fire that tightened with every second. Richter, clinging to the periscope handle, shouted commands, trying to save the boat, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of destruction. Miller and his engineers, risking their lives, scrambled through the engine room trying to stop the leaks, to patch the wounds of their steel beast. But it was all in vain. The final explosion, the most terrifying, detonated directly beneath the keel. The boat was literally thrown upwards, and then it began to fall into the abyss like a stone. The last thing they heard was the rising roar of seawater and the monstrous screech of metal being crushed like a tin can under a giant's boot. And then, the impact with the bottom. It wasn't sharp, more viscous, drawn out, almost soft, as if a giant sea monster had gently but firmly taken them into its silty embrace. And silence fell. A deafening, absolute, unnatural silence after the hell of explosions. In this silence, only the quiet moans of the wounded, the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors, and the dripping of water could be heard. Monotonous, merciless, maddening. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of their sentence. They were lying on the seabed. Half the crew was dead or seriously wounded. The aft compartments were completely flooded. The radio was smashed to pieces. The diesel and electric motors were out of action. They were trapped in a steel coffin at a depth from which there was no escape. The first few minutes passed in a primal, paralyzing shock. The men just sat in the darkness, unable to comprehend what had happened. Panic hung in the air, ready to explode into collective hysteria, and then Richter's voice cut through, calm, authoritative, icy. He lit an emergency lantern, and its narrow, trembling beam snatched his face from the darkness. Pale, with a bruise on his cheek, but utterly resolute. He looked at his terrified, wounded, weeping men, then at the massive, jammed hatch. And in that moment, he knew. If they were to survive, he had to become not just their commander, but their jailer, their prophet, and their god. The first hours on the seabed devolved into a ceaseless, surreal nightmare. The emergency lighting flickered, at times plunging them into absolute blackness, then flaring up again, snatching horrifying scenes from the dark. Faces contorted by pain and terror, dark pools of water mixed with fuel oil and blood, overturned and mangled equipment. The air quickly grew stale, heavy, with a metallic taste. The first, most urgent task was to assess the losses and the scale of the disaster. Richter and Miller, forgetting their hidden disagreements for the time being, worked together like two parts of a single machine. Richter, as commander, tried to restore a semblance of discipline, his sharp commands pulling men from their stupor. Muller, as engineer, with a grim, funereal methodicalness, inspected the damage, making his way through the twisted compartments. His verdict, delivered in a hoarse whisper in the control room, was bleak. The stern was crumpled like paper, the diving planes were jammed solid, the ballast tanks in the aft group were breached and full of water. Blowing the ballast and surfacing on their own was impossible. They were trapped. When the initial shock subsided, panic took its place. A young sailor, upon seeing his dead comrade, broke down into hysterics, his wild, animalistic screams echoing through the compartments, infecting the others with terror. Someone began to pray loudly, sobbing, while another just stared blankly at a single point, having lost all will and reason. This was the most dangerous moment. A mob driven to despair is more terrifying than any enemy. And Richter understood this. He walked over to the screaming sailor and without a word struck him hard across the face. The sailor fell silent, choking on his own scream, and went limp. In the ringing silence that followed, Richter's voice sounded like the click of a rifle bolt. Panic is treason. Anyone who succumbs to it will be considered a traitor to the Reich and will be punished. We are soldiers of the Kriegsmarine. Our duty is to wait. A rescue operation has surely already begun, and they will find us. Until then, there's only one law here. My law. It was a bold, shameless lie. He didn't know if an operation had begun. He knew nothing. But this lie was necessary. It was the foundation of steel and will upon which he intended to build their survival. He established a dictatorship, ironclad, absolute. First, a strict, ruthless inventory. It turned out there were only enough canned goods and hardtack for a few days if divided among all survivors. There was even less fresh water in the tanks. There were only a few sets of regenerative plates for air purification. Richter imposed a brutal ration: 1 biscuit and 100 grams of water per man, per day. Breathing was allowed only on command, slowly, shallowly, conserving every atom of oxygen. Any unnecessary movement was strictly forbidden. The boat sank into a state of suspended animation. The men lay in their bunks, transformed into living statues, saving oxygen and their remaining energy. But the most terrifying enemy was not hunger or suffocation. The most terrifying enemy was the silence. It pressed in, squeezed the temples, drove them mad. In it, each man heard only the deafening thud of his own heart and the ceaseless creaking of the hull, a constant reminder of the 90 meters of icy water above their heads. And then, the first rebel appeared, not for ideological reasons, but from simple animal fear. One of the mechanics, driven mad by thirst, tried to steal a flask of water from a wounded comrade during the night. He was caught. Richter held a show trial. By the light of a single lantern before a silent, ominous formation of emaciated shadows, he announced the sentence. Not execution. Bullets were too precious. He ordered the thief to be chained to a bulkhead in the farthest compartment and deprived of his water ration for 2 days. It was a slow, agonizing execution, and everyone understood this perfectly. Miller tried to object. "Commander, this is inhuman. He was just mad with thirst. He didn't know what he was doing." But Richter looked at him with his icy, empty eyes. "There are no men here, Miller. There are only soldiers. And there is discipline. He broke it. He endangered all of us. His suffering will be a clear lesson for the others." And it worked. The fear of the commander proved stronger than the fear of death. Anarchy was crushed in its infancy. The new system, the system of survival in a steel coffin, began to function. But the main, existential problem remained unsolved. The supply of regenerative plates was running out. They had only a few hours of breathable air left. It seemed to be over. Müller, having made his final calculations on a scrap of paper, told Richter with a grim, almost gloating satisfaction. "This is it, Herr Kapitänleutnant. Your iron will has not saved us. In 3 hours, we will begin to lose consciousness. We will suffocate." And it was precisely then that the quiet, unassuming radio man, Werner Voss, his face cyanotic from hypoxia, uttered barely audible words that were both a salvation and pure madness. Herr Kapitän, we have torpedoes. Everyone looked at Voss as if he were insane. Manic sparks danced in his eyes, clouded by the lack of oxygen. Torpedoes were weapons, death, encased in long steel cigars. What could they possibly have to do with air, with life? But Voss, stammering with excitement and weakness, began to explain the idea that had been born in his brilliant but tormented mind on the very edge of consciousness. He was not just a radio man. He was a self-taught technical genius who knew the boat's design better than many engineers. He remembered the technical specifications of the G7E torpedoes. Their hydrogen peroxide engines used compressed air to spin up the gyroscopes and operate the steering mechanisms. It wasn't pure oxygen, but it was air. Air under immense pressure, sealed in the strong steel reservoirs of each of the 4 torpedoes remaining in the bow tubes. The idea was insane and incredibly dangerous. To get to those reservoirs, they would have to partially dismantle the torpedo's warhead, risking the detonation of hundreds of kilograms of explosives from the slightest spark or careless movement. They would have to use makeshift materials, scraps of hoses, valves stripped from other systems, to create a complex system of regulators to slowly bleed the air into the compartment, drop by drop, without creating an overpressure that could rupture the weakened hull from within. Any mistake, and they would either be vaporized in a cloud of incandescent gas, poisoned by oil fumes, or die of the bends. Erich Müller, after listening to him, just snorted contemptuously at first. The ramblings of a madman. The pressure in those tanks will kill us faster than suffocation. Besides, if the detonator is triggered by our meddling. But Richter, whose own mind was beginning to fog, saw a chance in this insane idea. The only one. The last one. He looked at Voss not as a timid youth, but as a prophet, a savior. Müller, you are an engineer. You will make this work. That is an order. For the pragmatic mechanic, this was a monstrous test. He didn't believe in its success, but an order was an order. Besides, the challenge to his professional skills, his engineering pride, was too great to refuse. Thus began the most surreal and tense operation in the history of the submarine fleet. In the dim light of emergency lanterns, in an atmosphere where every breath was a luxury, Müller, Voss, and a couple of other mechanics who could still stand began to officiate over the torpedo in the first tube. Their movements were slow, measured, like those of sappers in a minefield. Every turn of a wrench, every faint click of metal on metal echoed through the tomb-like silence of the boat with a deep, ominous resonance. The rest of the crew watched them, holding their breath, not daring to even move. This was their last hope, their final gamble with death. They worked for several endless hours at the absolute limit of human endurance. Their lungs burned, their vision darkened from oxygen deprivation, sweat poured into their eyes. Finally, Müller, his face black with grease and sweat, gave a thumbs up. The improvised system was ready. He slowly, by 1/100th of a turn, opened the valve of the makeshift regulator. A soft, barely audible, divine hiss was heard, and a thin, life-saving stream of air flowed into the compartment. It was cold with a sharp smell of oil and ozone, but it was air. The men inhaled it greedily, with pleasure, with tears in their eyes. It was like a miracle, a resurrection from the dead. They had defeated suffocation. This was their first real victory. Small, fragile, but it instilled in their tormented souls a new, almost forgotten emotion. Hope. They had cheated death. They had learned to breathe again. But they did not yet know that their underwater prison did not forgive those who broke its laws. The hissing of the released air created a subtle, low-frequency vibration that traveled through the steel hull, into the water, and into the silty seabed. It was the sound of life, and this sound did not go unnoticed. There, in the eternal darkness and cold of the Baltic floor, were other inhabitants, those who were eternally hungry and who were very interested in this new, strange, rhythmic sound. The success with the torpedoes transformed Klaus Richter. The fanatical fire in his eyes, which had begun to fade, flared up again. He saw it not as mere engineering luck, but as a sign from above. Incontrovertible proof that Providence was on their side, that their mission was not yet over, that great Germany had not forgotten its loyal sons. He decided that passive waiting was not enough. They must not just survive. They must build their own state, their own little underwater empire, which would become a model of indomitable German spirit and iron will. The boat was transformed into a harsh, almost monastic order, living by laws dictated by the commander. Richter established a brutal daily routine, scheduled to the minute and scratched onto a bulkhead. Wake up at the signal. A short but fervent prayer for the Führer and the final victory of the Reich. A meager ration that now seemed like a feast for the gods. And then, work. Hard, monotonous, grueling work. Everyone was assigned a task. Müller and his mechanics became the high priests of a new cult, the cult of air. They were responsible for the life support system, taking turns to bleed air from the torpedoes with surgical precision, monitoring its composition with primitive indicators, and constantly seeking ways to improve the makeshift filtration system, even using scraps of their uniforms. Radioman Voss, now one of the most respected men on board, was ordered to try to repair the hydroacoustic station. Like a mad alchemist, he conjured over scraps of wire and damaged circuit boards, trying to assemble ears from the wreckage that might hear salvation. The others were engaged in endless Sisyphean labor, pumping out seeping water with hand pumps, cleaning the compartments of mold and grime, caring for the wounded. Even old boatswain Wagner found a purpose. He became the keeper of morale. In a quiet, hoarse voice that sounded like creaking old wood, he told old sea legends about the Flying Dutchman, about mermaids luring sailors into the abyss, about the sea serpent. These simple, unadorned stories were as much a salvation for their tormented souls as the air from the torpedoes was for their lungs. They created an illusion of normality, a reminder that outside this steel box, a world full of wonders and dangers still existed. Richter ruled his empire with an iron fist. Any sign of weakness, any word of doubt, was punished immediately and cruelly, by withholding rations, the most terrible punishment in their world. He forced the men to believe. He turned their survival into a sacred ritual. Every gram of water saved, every gulp of air procured, he presented as a small victory in their great struggle for the future of the Reich. And the men, exhausted, hungry, on the brink of madness, clung to this faith like a drowning man to a straw. Their empire gave them not only physical resources, but something far more important, a purpose. They were not just victims of a disaster. They were fighters. They were the last outpost of the Reich, lost at the bottom of the ocean. This illusion was as fragile as ice, but it worked. The days blurred into one endless cycle of work, waiting, and meager sleep in the cold and darkness. But they were alive, they were breathing, and they were waiting. Erich Müller watched all this with a grim, cold skepticism. He performed his job flawlessly. His engineering genius kept this dying organism alive. But he did not share Richter's fanaticism. He kept his own secret ledger in a small notebook. How many calories were left in the hardtack? How many hours of operation the worn-out pumps could withstand? The rate of corrosion of the hull under the pressure of salt water, and his numbers were merciless. They could prolong the agony for a week, maybe two, but no longer. Rescue would not come. He knew this with mathematical certainty. One night, as Richter was once again delivering his fiery speech about imminent rescue and the coming victory, Müller couldn't take it anymore. He approached the commander and said quietly so that only they could hear, "You're lying to them, Herr Kapitän. And you know it yourself. No one is coming. The war is lost. We are dying here for an illusion." Richter slowly turned to him. In the dim lamplight, his eyes burned with a cold, inhuman fire. "Faith, Müller," he hissed, "is also a resource. And right now, it's more important than water or air. You are an engineer. You give them the means to breathe. I am the commander. I give them a reason to breathe. and if you try to take that reason from them, I will destroy you." Their life had settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They had grown accustomed to the hunger, the cold, the perpetual twilight. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of the New World. In the darkness of the central compartment where the discontented gathered, a mutiny began to brew. Müller's words to Richter were just the tip of the iceberg breaking the surface. The engineer was not a conspirator. He was a realist driven to despair. But his doubts, his cold, mathematically calculated hopelessness, began to seep into the crew like seawater through micro cracks in the hull. Unwittingly, he became a center of gravity for those who were tired of believing the commander's fairy tales of imminent triumph. These were not cowards or traitors. They were men whose survival instincts had proven stronger than ideology. They saw the supplies dwindling, their comrades weakening, and their commander sinking deeper into his world of fanatical illusions. Their informal leader was not Müller himself, who was too withdrawn and unsociable, but one of the senior sailors, Franz, a sturdy, pragmatic man from Hamburg who had worked in a shipyard before the war and knew the boat's design like the back of his hand. He respected Müller as a specialist and saw the truth in his ruthless calculations. Franz and his supporters, about 10 of them, devised their own plan, daring and desperate. They believed that waiting for rescue was suicide. Their only chance was to try to surface themselves. They knew the main systems were damaged, but Franz believed that if they redirected all remaining battery power to the emergency blow pumps and simultaneously delivered a powerful pulse of compressed air from the torpedo reservoirs, they might be able to break free from the seabed. It was an almost certain risk. The boat might not withstand the pressure change during the ascent and be crushed, or they could surface right under the keel of an enemy destroyer. But for them, this risk was better than a slow, guaranteed death from suffocation and starvation in this steel grave. The conflict simmered for several days. The boat split into 2 invisible camps. Richter's supporters, inspired by his unbending will, and the party of despair, which rallied around Franz and the silent figure of Müller. The tension became almost physical, hanging in the stale air heavier than carbon dioxide, ready to explode at any spark. The climax came on the 15th day of their confinement. Franz's group decided to act. At night, during the nominal watch change, they tried to seize the control room and gain access to the ballast blow controls. But Richter seemed to never sleep. His spies were everywhere. The conspirators were met. A short, ugly, desperate brawl erupted in the confines of the compartment. No one used weapons. They fought with fists, wrenches, anything that came to hand. It was not a battle of soldiers, but a desperate scuffle of dying men fighting for one last gulp of air, for one last ghostly hope. Richter personally, with a cold, rabid fury, subdued the mutineers. He fought like a berserker, his fanatical energy seeming to multiply his strength tenfold. The mutiny was crushed. Richter once again assembled all the survivors. This time, he made no speeches. He just stared silently at the conspirators, beaten and humiliated. Everyone expected a brutal reprisal. But Richter did something different. He applied what might later be called surgical cruelty. He did not punish everyone. He chose only one, Franz, the ringleader. He didn't kill him. He ordered that Franz be given his full daily ration of water and food, and then locked in torpedo tube number 3 after the torpedo had been unloaded. "You wanted to go up, Franz," Richter said in an icy voice. "You'll get your chance. You'll be the closest to salvation. Wait for it there." This was worse than death. To be locked in a narrow steel tube, in complete, absolute darkness, alone, where the only sounds were the beating of your own heart and the groaning of the hull. It was torture by madness. Müller, who was also detained but left unharmed, he was too valuable as an engineer, watched with horror and disgust. He realized that Richter had crossed a final line, beyond which a commander becomes a monster. He had upheld his law. The mutiny was suppressed. A dead, fearful silence fell over the boat. But while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice that their true enemy, the sea, was preparing its final crushing blow. It was at that moment that Werner Voss, pale as a sheet, tore the headphones of his jury-rigged hydroacoustic station from his head and whispered, stammering, "They're here. I hear propellers. Many propellers. Right above us." Voss's announcement acted like an electric shock, pulling everyone from their internal hell back to the external threat. They all froze, listening. And indeed, through the familiar groaning of the hull, a new, previously unheard sound now penetrated. A low, rhythmic, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere, seeping through the steel, through the water, straight into their bones. It was the sound of turning propellers. Many propellers. The heavy, measured bass thrum of large transport ships and the higher, predatory, nervous whine of escort destroyers. It was an enemy convoy. Fate, with a cruel, sadistic irony, had dangled bait before them. Up there, just 100 meters, 330 feet away, was life. Ships were passing, laden with weapons, soldiers, supplies. The enemy was passing. For the crew, locked in their underwater tomb, this sound was both a torment and the greatest temptation. They were hunters, wolves locked in a cage while an entire flock of fat sheep walked by. And in that moment, in the mind of Klaus Richter, on the very edge of desperation and ecstasy, his final, most insane, and most magnificent plan was born. He looked at his men, emaciated, broken by internal conflict, but still soldiers. He saw the old, predatory, almost forgotten glint ignite in their dull eyes. And he knew this was their chance. Not for salvation. For a worthy death. For immortality. He gathered everyone in the control room. His voice, weakened by hunger, sounded firmer and more confident than ever, booming in the resonant silence. For 19 days, we have waited. We have fought against water, suffocation, despair, and ourselves. We have survived. And now the Reich, Providence, God himself gives us one last chance to do our duty. Up there, the enemy is passing. We have one working torpedo left in tube number 4 and the last amps in our batteries. We will not spend them to prolong our pathetic lives for a few more hours. We will spend them to die as soldiers. We will surface and give them one last fight. It was pure, unadulterated madness. To attack a convoy in their condition was guaranteed suicide. But it was exactly what they needed. It was a purpose. A great, heroic, meaningful purpose that at once nullified all their suffering, all the horror of the past weeks. The prospect of dying in battle, taking an enemy transport down with them, was infinitely more appealing than a slow, humiliating fade-out in the cold, stinking darkness. Even Muller, the chief skeptic, was silent. In this madness there was its own terrible, irrefutable logic. Better to burn out in one bright moment than to smolder forever. The boat came alive. Forgetting hunger and weakness, the men rushed to their battle stations. The energy of despair, the last and most powerful energy, awoke in them. The mechanics, under Muller's direction, began to work their magic on the batteries, squeezing out the last drops of power, redirecting it to the motors and blow pumps. The torpedo men prepared the single remaining torpedo for launch. Richter stood at the periscope like a general before a decisive battle. The process of preparing to surface was hell. They had to manually turn rusted valves with superhuman effort, pressurize the ballast tanks, praying the worn metal would hold. The boat groaned, trembled, resisted, unwilling to leave its silty lair on the seabed. Finally, with a monstrous screech that seemed to crack the seafloor, it broke free from the bottom. The ascent began. These were the longest and most terrifying minutes of their lives. Everyone was silent, listening as the pitch of the hull's groaning changed, as the pressure inside the compartments grew. Their ears popped, their bodies ached. They were rising from their grave to face their final battle, to face Valhalla. 10 meters to the surface! 5! We've surfaced! The boat burst out of the water like a tired, wounded whale, rocking heavily on the gentle waves. Raise periscope! Richter commanded. His hands, trembling with tension, gripped the handles. Now he would see them, the gray, menacing silhouettes of destroyers, the fat sides of transports. He was already choosing the most worthy, the largest target for their last torpedo. He pressed his eye to the eyepiece. But what he saw did not fit into his inflamed consciousness. There were no destroyers, no transports. The horizon was pristinely clear. Only a few cable lengths away, a small, shabby, rusty vessel bobbed peacefully on the waves. A fishing trawler from whose smokestack a lazy wisp of blue smoke curled. And above this trawler, a flag fluttered lazily in the light April wind. A British flag. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the people standing on the deck, fishermen in greasy overalls. They were looking at the German submarine that had surfaced from nowhere, not with fear, but with a kind of lazy, surprised, almost rustic curiosity. One of them, an old man with a gray beard, even waved at them. The world of Kapitänleutnant Klaus Richter, a world built on iron, blood, and unwavering faith, collapsed the moment he saw the waving fishermen. In his universe, built on hatred, struggle, and a clear, stark division between friend and foe, there was no place for this simple, mundane gesture. He had expected to see the fire of cannons, planes diving towards him, death, a heroic demise. Instead, he saw a routine, almost pastoral scene that was more terrifying and humiliating than any attack. He staggered back from the periscope, his face as white as chalk, his lips moving soundlessly. "This can't be. It's a trap," he whispered. The crew, not understanding what was happening, looked at their commander, their god, who had suddenly turned into a confused, frightened man. Where was the battle? Where was the order? Torpedo! Fire! But the order never came. The trawler, meanwhile, had changed course and was slowly, unhurriedly approaching them. From its side, a voice came through an old, rattling megaphone in broken, terrible German. "Hey, on the boat! War kaput! Finished! You surrender?" War kaput. Those two simple, crude words echoed in the control room of U-2342 louder than any explosion. They did not bring relief. They did not bring joy. They brought emptiness. An absolute, all-consuming void. 20 days. 20 days of hell, of hunger, of fighting for every breath of air. 20 days of iron discipline, a suppressed mutiny, of faith and salvation, in victory, in a great mission. All of it had been meaningless, useless, stupid, a farce. They had been dying for a war that was already over. Their feat of survival, their little underwater empire, all of it was a tragic, ugly comedy played out in a steel box on the seafloor for an invisible audience. The first to break was not Richter. He just froze, turning into a statue of himself. The first to laugh was Erich Müller. He laughed for a long time hysterically until he cried, until he hiccuped, until he convulsed. He sat on the floor, hugging himself, and roared with laughter like a madman. In that laughter was everything: relief, bitterness, hatred, and the realization of the monstrous, cosmic absurdity of their situation. His laughter broke the tension, burst the dam of shock. The men began to emerge from their stupor. Some cried, quietly, soundlessly. Some smiled stupidly, unable to believe it. Some swore, foully, viciously, spewing out all their pain and resentment. Their war was over. Not in victory, not in defeat. It had simply evaporated like a morning mist, leaving behind only the bitter taste of meaninglessness. They were taken prisoner by ordinary British fishermen, without a single shot fired. The crew of U-2342, or what was left of it, was too weak to resist or even think of resisting. As they, squinting from the unfamiliar, searing sunlight, climbed one by one onto the deck of their steel coffin, the fishermen looked at them with horror, disgust, and pity. These were not formidable submarine aces, not grey wolves. They were walking skeletons covered in grey, dirty skin with mad, sunken eyes. They were transferred to a British warship that arrived later, summoned by the trawler. There they were fed and given medical attention. They were saved. But this salvation felt like fate's final, cruelest joke. At the prisoner of war camp where they were taken, an interrogation was held. A British intelligence officer, young, clean-shaven, smelling of good tobacco and soap, listened with polite, almost academic curiosity to Richter's account of their 20-day odyssey. He nodded, taking notes in a pad. When Richter finished, standing proudly erect, the officer thought for a moment, then asked in an almost apologetic tone, "Forgive me, Captain. I must have misunderstood something. You said you hit the bottom on April 7th and waited all this time for rescue because you believed the war was still going on?" Richter lifted his chin proudly. "Yes, we did our duty to the end." The British officer sighed. "Captain," he said softly, almost sympathetically, as one would speak to the terminally ill. "The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 3 weeks ago. Berlin fell on May 2nd. Your Führer committed suicide on April 30th. You were fighting ghosts. Your Reich no longer exists. The fates of the crew of U-2342, torn from their underwater grave into a world they no longer recognized, and which did not recognize them, varied. Their brotherhood, forged in inhuman conditions, fused by common suffering and common faith, was destroyed the moment they learned the truth. Now, each man was alone with his personal tragedy, his own meaninglessness. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Richter could never accept the new reality. The British officer's words had not just destroyed his faith, they had destroyed his very identity, knocking the steel rod from his spine. He had built his entire life on a foundation of duty, loyalty, and a great mission. When that foundation turned to dust, he collapsed with it. In the POW camp he was defiant, refused to obey orders, and continued to speak of a victory that was just around the corner, of the Führer's secret weapon. At first they laughed at him. Then they began to consider him insane. After his release he returned to a ruined, divided Germany but found no place for himself. He was a ghost of the past, a man whose war had never ended. It was said that until the end of his days, he wore his old faded tunic, refusing to believe in the surrender. He died in the early 50s in a small mental hospital somewhere in Bavaria, deliriously giving orders to dive and crying out his Führer's name. Chief Engineer Erich Miller, a pragmatist to the core, proved to be the most adaptable to the new life. For him, the collapse of the Reich was not a personal tragedy, but merely the confirmation of a sad but obvious fact his engineering mind had long foreseen. He survived captivity, returned home, and became one of those who rebuilt the ruined country on their own shoulders. He worked as an engineer at a factory, building bridges and plants. He never told anyone about the 20 days at the bottom of the Baltic. That experience remained deep inside him, like an unhealing, festering scar. Sometimes at night he dreamed of the creak of the hull being squeezed by pressure and the acrid, oily taste of air from a torpedo tank. He lived a long, quiet life and died in his bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew that their calm, silent grandfather had once been a god of machines in a steel hell. Radio man Werner Voss, the genius whose surprise weapon had saved them from suffocation, found his calling after the war in the new booming field of electronics. His talent was noticed, and it was rumored that he worked in a research laboratory, first in Britain and then in West Germany. He immersed himself in the world of radio waves and transistors, as if trying to hide in this new, clean, logical, and predictable world from the memories of sticky fear and the smell of death. Old boatswain Kurt Wagner returned to his native fishing village on the coast. He went back to sea, but this time on a small, peaceful trawler. He would sit on the deck, mending nets and telling young fishermen old sea tales. But never, not with a single word, did he mention U-2342. That story was buried within him as deeply as the boat itself had once lain on the seabed. The fate of the young sailor Hans Schmidt became the most tragic postscript to this story. He never learned that the war was over. He died on the 19th day of their confinement, just a few hours before Richter made his final, fateful decision to surface. He died of exhaustion and suffocation, clutching an unfinished letter to his mother in his cooling hand, in which he promised to return home soon. A hero. His death, which at the time, in the darkness of the compartment, seemed a part of their common struggle, was transformed by the news of the surrender into a symbol of the absolute, monstrous, universal meaninglessness of their sacrifice. They outlived him by only a single day, but that day separated their worlds forever. The official history of the Second World War is a history of great battles, strategic decisions, and the movement of front lines. It is a history of maps, arrows, and generals' memoirs. In this history, there is no place for the submarine U-2342 and its crew. In military archives, it is most likely listed as Missing in Action, April 1945. A simple, anonymous line in a long list of losses. Their incredible 20-day odyssey. Their struggle for life at the limits of human endurance. Their small underwater empire built on the will of one man and the genius of another. All of it was classified, buried under the heading of inconvenient truth, or simply dismissed as an insignificant episode. To the victors, their story was merely a curious case, a funny anecdote about stubborn, foolish Germans. To the vanquished, it was a painful reminder of a total collapse, of the madness that had consumed an entire nation. No one was interested in this story becoming public knowledge, and so the feat of these men was erased, expunged, forgotten. But history is not only archives and official documents, it is also human memory, a whisper, a legend. And the story of U-2342 survived. It did not die with its last participants. It was said that among the British fishermen who worked the southern Baltic, a tale of a Flying Dutchman with a swastika circulated for a long time, of a ghostly German submarine covered in rust and seaweed that would sometimes, on foggy nights, surface silently from the depths, a lone captain's figure on its bridge, staring at an empty horizon in search of an enemy who would never come. Among the former German submariners who survived the war and gathered in portside taverns, this story became a dark, cautionary legend told in whispers over a mug of beer. The legend of the forgotten crew, of men who were so loyal to their duty that they continued to fight even after peace had been declared. This story is not a chronicle of military heroism. It is a parable of how the strongest faith can become the most terrible curse, of how the will to live, pushed to its absolute limit, can prove to be monstrously meaningless. It is a reminder that the most terrifying enemy in war is not the enemy's soldiers or the depth charges. The most terrifying enemy is oblivion. It kills not the body, but the meaning. It turns heroism into madness and sacrifice into a ridiculous tragicomic accident. The crew of U-2342 won their battle against the sea, the cold, suffocation, hunger, and madness. But they lost the war against time and memory. And yet, as long as we tell this story, their struggle was not in vain. It becomes a reminder that behind the dry statistics of casualties, there are always living human souls. And that even in the deepest darkness, in the most hopeless situation, man is capable of the incredible, even if it is never written down in the history books.